So thank you everybody for taking the time to join us today for this webinar on biological hazards. And in particular, I think the document that is critical for us today and for you as an audience is the regulations for hazardous biological agents that's commenced on the 16th of March, 2022. And I want to immediately go over to my first question, and that is to Jabu from the Department of Employment and Labor. What is the scope and key objective of the revised hazardous biological agents regulations in South Africa, and how effective are these regulations in achieving the objectives?
Good morning, colleagues. In responding to the question, the scope of the hazardous biological agents, the regulations apply to all workplaces where there might be exposure to hazardous biological agents, and whereby the hazardous biological agents are being handled, they are being processed, or they are being stored. Therefore, this scope applies to all the workplaces because we've seen with the pandemic for SARS-CoV-2, even in places whereby we didn't expect the presence of hazardous biological agents, we have seen employees who have been affected from those workplaces. For example, the office space. Therefore, since the promulgation of these regulations, we have seen a lot of change in workplaces whereby employers and employees became aware of the reality of hazardous biological agents in all workplaces. And the measures that were put in place, they are still applicable even today, because we can say the HBAs are no longer existing in our workplaces.
Well, thanks. Then a quick follow-up on that. What are the roles and responsibilities of the different role players in the workplace, the employers, workers, the employees, and other stakeholders in ensuring compliance with these regulations?
Okay, when it comes to employers, the first step in the control of exposure to hazardous biological agents is the risk assessment. You know, the risk assessment will inform the employers, employees, even the stakeholders on the presence of hazardous biological agents at the workplace. Also, another thing is to monitor the exposure of hazardous biological agents at the workplace. So that is also the key important role for the employer. The other issue is to train and inform the employees about the effects and the presence of HBAs at the workplaces. Because when employees are aware of these agents, they will be able to take control and make sure that they are protected against the HBAs. Another key issue is for the employer is to conduct medical surveillance, especially for those employees who were identified during the risk assessment that they need to undergo medical surveillance. Also, another thing is to provide control measures and to maintain those control measures, because we've seen in the past, engineering controls will be put in place, but due to lack of maintenance, they are no longer becoming effective. Therefore, employees' roles is also important. Employees, they need to also make sure that they protect themselves against the HBAs by utilizing the control measures, especially the PPE that has been provided by the employer. And also they need to also obey any lawful instruction that is given by the employer to protect themselves. Stakeholders, their role is to assist the department to report any non-compliances that they become aware of, so that the department can take measures to send the inspectors to check those employers.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to come to you, Tanusha, on the hazardous biological agent itself, you know, the definition. And so the question would be, how are hazardous biological agents classified under these regulations?
Thank you so much, Ashraf, for that question. It's indeed an important one, because often people misunderstand the difference between the risk group classification and the biosafety levels. So the assumption is that if you have a biological agent that is assigned to, for example, a risk group 3, then people assume that it would be a biosafety level 3 application. But that's not entirely true, because risk groups are not equated to the biosafety levels. So to answer your question, Ashraf, I'm going to cover both the biosafety levels as well as the risk group classifications. So the hazardous biological agents are classified into 4 risk groups based on their pathogenicity, the impact on public health, and it also takes into consideration the mode of transmission and whether there is effective treatment or vaccines that are available. And the risk group systems ranges from risk group 1 to risk group 4, and that includes agents that are not known to cause disease in healthy beings, and that is your risk group 1 agents, and it ranges to risk group 4, where these agents then cause life-threatening diseases like your Ebola, for example. Now, on the other hand, your biological safety levels is a system that is used to classify facilities based on the level of containment that is required to ensure safety. And these includes your laboratories, your healthcare facilities, as well as industrial processes where they handle hazardous biological agents. Now, there are 4 levels, and these levels must correspond to the hazard, the risk that is posed, as well as the type of facility or activity that is conducted in those facilities, where you get your biosafety level 1, which corresponds to agents that pose minimal hazard to workers and the environment, and then you get your biosafety level 4, which corresponds or relates to those agents that then cause the highest threat to workers and the environment. So in summary, your risk group classification is used to assess the potential health risk, while the biosafety level determines the level of containment to protect workers and environment. Now, these classifications are very important because they help in developing appropriate measures to prevent accidental release or intentional misuse of these agents. So we want to ensure that there are effective control measures to reduce the risk of exposure. And I want to touch on some, maybe a few examples to illustrate this point, Ashraf. So assuming you have an agent that is not classified, or one where you are unsure of the group to assign to, and this is particularly true for emerging agents like we've seen with SARS-CoV-2, then you will then assign it to a higher group. So initially, if you look at SARS-CoV-2, given the unprecedented spread of the disease, it was assigned a risk group 4. And we know these are agents that cause life-threatening diseases where there are no effective treatment or vaccines available. But as the pandemic progressed and more epidemiological evidence and clinical data became available, the risk group was downgraded to a risk group 3. Now, this does not imply that you need to only work at a biosafety level 3, because it really depends on the activity that is performed using the agent. So if you are isolating or culturing or storing the virus over a long term, then you will ensure that you have biosafety level 3 measures in place. However, if you're performing routine diagnostics, then that can be done safely at a biosafety level 2. So these principles also apply to, for example, TB. And TB is also assigned a risk group level 3 in the regulations. Another classic example is Ebola, which is a risk group 4 agent. However, most often, routine diagnostics during outbreak situations are conducted under biosafety level 2, employing additional measures based on the risk assessment. These are field laboratories that are set up in outbreaks, and they operate under biosafety level 2 conditions, like we've seen in West Africa during the Ebola outbreak. Another example is if you have a risk group level 1 biological agent. Now, you know that you don't necessarily have to have any physical containment measures in place because the harm to humans is low. But if that agent was genetically modified it may be assigned a higher risk group, even a level 3, for example, because of its environmental risks that's associated with it. So in cases of genetically modified biological agents that are not hazardous to humans, but are environmentally harmful, then more stringent biosafety levels or physical containment will be required. Assuming, for example, we have a high risk group agent that has been attenuated, and by that we mean it's lost its virulence or pathogenicity, then the containment required by the classification of its parent strain would not necessarily apply. But Ashraf, you know, there are so many examples that we can touch on, but time doesn't permit. But I think it's important for the audience to know that the risk groups does not equate to the biosafety levels.
Thank you. That lays a very good technical basis for our discussion as well, and understanding the biological agents. So what types of hazardous biological agents are regulated under South African law, and maybe which sort of workplaces it might be applicable to, Tanisha?
Okay, well, the regulation covers a broad range of biological agents. These include microorganisms like your bacteria, your fungi, your parasites, viruses, including microbial byproducts or metabolites of these agents like your endotoxins, your aflatoxins, and other biological material, including cells or organic material from plants, animals, as well as human origin. It also covers blood or bodily fluids that may contain infectious agents, as well as genetically modified ones. So the regulation covers both infectious and non-infectious agents, those that causes allergies and toxicity, for example, and it applies to all workplaces, including healthcare and non-healthcare facilities. The big difference, Ashraf, in the revised regulation is the inclusion of fungi. As many will know, that fungi was not included in the previous version. Now, this is fundamentally important because the fungi are a diverse group of organisms, and some of them can cause allergies, toxic effects, not just infections, and other health problems, particularly for workers who are exposed to them regularly. So the inclusion is important, and I can give you an example of a worker who maybe handles processed organic material like hay or grain or compost. They may be exposed to these fungal spores, which can cause respiratory disease like aspergillosis. So it has serious consequences, and some of them, as I said, can produce mycotoxins, which is toxic if workers ingest or inhale it. So to conclude, it does include a wide array of biological agents.
Thank you. Tikledi, if I could ask you the following. What is the importance of conducting the risk assessment we also heard about earlier? And does it apply to ordinary workplaces, not just healthcare settings, you know, the broad range as Tanisha referred to earlier?
Okay. Thank you, Ashraf, and good morning, colleagues. Yes, risk assessment does apply to all workplaces, including those that are regarded as ordinary workplaces. And it ensures that the employer provides a safe working environment for the employees. And it involves identifying the sources of HBAs by looking at the nature of the HBA and looking at the route of exposure. And also it looks at the type of tasks or the work process in which the employees can be exposed to and who may be affected as well. And that include your immunocompromised individuals, your pregnant women, and those that are vulnerable. And also it looks at health effects that may be caused by the HBA, and that may either be infectious, it may be allergic, or it can cause toxic reactions. And also it looks at existing control measures, whether they are effective and they have been maintained. And if there is any lack of control measures, so it looks at whether additional ones are needed. And it's important to note that employers also must consider the recommendations that has been made or identified from the risk assessment to ensure that they are implemented, and they must have an action plan in place to implement it. And if I may add to that also is that risk assessment must be reviewed at intervals not exceeding 2 years, or it can be less than 2 years if there are any changes in the processes in the workplace or changes in equipment, for example, or if there has been an incident that has been reported in the workplace. Also, when the medical surveillance reveals the adverse health effects that are linked to exposure to HBAs.
I guess like when SARS-CoV-2 arrived suddenly and affected our workplaces, those risk assessments all needed to be reviewed.
Yes.
Thanks, Dikoledi. Jabu, the control measures referred to just a moment ago, also again by Dikoledi. What control measures can employers put in place to prevent the exposure to hazardous biological agents, the things that makes us sick at work? What sort of control measures would you say is important?
What is important is that not a single measure will work for all the workplaces or the given environment. Therefore, we recommend different combination of the control measures. So firstly, the employer can implement what we call standard precautions. For example, hand hygiene, gloves, face or eye protection, protective clothing, or respiratory protective equipment. Other additional measures that are in place, they can implement the measures identified through the risk assessment, as Dikoledi has already alluded to that. Also, they can limit the amount of HBAs that are used in that workplace, or they can limit the number of employees that could be exposed. Also, the employers can limit the duration of exposure of employees. Yes. Also, there are other control measures like you separate the different infectious processes, or you put a barrier to isolate different processes, or you can use the local exhaust ventilation or the general ventilation. Also, with the new regulation, we have introduced the provision of vaccination where applicable. I need to emphasize the fact that we are not saying it is mandatory, but where it is indicated as a need for an employee to be vaccinated, then the employees can also be vaccinated. Also, the appropriate work procedures will also assist in the limiting the exposure of employees to HBAs. Also, the display of a biohazard sign is important so that employees must know where there is the presence of HBAs. Also, specifying the procedures to be taken when handling samples that might contain the HBAs. So as I'm saying, there's a combination of control measures. Employers must not look at a specific control measure.
And I would assume if it's not too freezing outside, open windows helps with the ventilation.
Yes, general ventilation.
Lady, over to you. What are the requirements for exposure monitoring of hazardous biological agents, and how often should this monitoring be carried out?
Okay, when it comes to exposure monitoring, the employer must have an exposure monitoring program in place, and it must be a validated procedure with proven effectiveness. And it must be conducted by a competent person. And the interval also is similar to that of risk assessment. It must not exceed 24 months. And it can be done also when there's changes that happens in the workplace. And similarly, also the employer must develop an action plan to ensure that the implementation of the recommendations that have been made in the exposure monitoring report.
Okay, thanks for that. Jabu, if I could just quickly come back to you again on the requirements for emergency response. I mean, we knew that SARS-CoV-2 came along and we had COVID-19 as an issue in the workplace, that the emergency response procedures were important. So what are the requirements for emergency response procedures in the event of accidental release or exposure to hazardous biological agents?
Thank you. With the pandemic of SARS-CoV-2, we've seen that employers need to have the emergency response plan in place. So what we are saying is that that plan needs to outline the reporting of emergencies, how the emergencies must be reported, and how will the employees be alerted if there is an emergency. The plan must indicate that. Also, they need to have evacuation routes. Just during the emergency, these will be the routes that will be used. Also, there needs to be an emergency response team in place at all the workplaces. Also, the plan must indicate the designated assembly points, because people need to know where to go during the emergency. Also, there needs to be, for the emergency plan, also there needs to be contact numbers for those emergency personnel. Also, who is responsible for first aid or any medical assistance, employees need to know that. Then the plan must also indicate how will the place be decontaminated or disinfected after the emergency has occurred. Also include the exposure control procedures, and it is important that workplaces or employers need to control emergency drills so that during the emergency, employees are aware what to do. It mustn't come as a shock.
Particularly, what are the requirements for training employees, for training workers who work with hazardous biological agents? And I can imagine there are people within the health settings and people in the non-health settings, including the fungi that has been also included in the regulations. And what defines a competent person?
Okay. The employer must ensure that any employee at risk of exposure to HBA is informed and is trained on the hazards and the risks involved, as well as the content of the scope of the regulation itself, the Hazardous Biological Agent regulation, and also on the health risks associated with exposure to the HBA, and to ensure that they understand also the importance of good housekeeping and personal hygiene, as well as the necessity of reporting for medical surveillance to ensure that they are protected in their workplace. And also that the employees must understand on how to use the PPE, your personal protective equipment, and your respiratory protective equipment correctly. And they must ensure that it's also fitting for when it doesn't fit, they may be exposed to the HBAs, and that the correct use of PPE must include the donning and removal of PPE. Also, they must understand which safe working procedures to use, for example, where there is spillage or leakage, where there will be release of HBAs. They must know the procedure, what to do, and how to decontaminate that area as well. And they must understand what the employers put into place as control measures to protect them, which include your maintenance of your engineering controls. And when it comes to a competent person, the personnel must have required knowledge, and they must understand what involves the hazards and risk associated with the type of job, as well as understand the acts or the laws and legislations associated with the work being done. And they must also have the relevant training and the experience in doing the work that needs to be done. And where applicable, they must also have the relevant qualification. The qualification must of course be the recognized and be the registered qualification.
Well, thanks for that. My final question before we get to take-home messages, we were about, I guess, a minute or so for this question, Jabu. So how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the implementation and enforcement of these regulations? I mean, the regulations are relatively new, March 2022, and was obviously impacted and affected by the arrival of SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19 in the workplaces. What are the key lessons that have been learned from that experience?
Okay, just to clarify that even before the pandemic, we had the hazardous biological agents that were promulgated in 2001.
Yes, the updated version started.
Yes. So
March
when the
2022.
pandemic came, we were already in the process of reviewing
Ah.
the current regulations that were promulgated in 2022. But the thing that assisted, I would say the pandemic assisted the awareness to all workplaces when it comes to hazardous biological agents, because I think most people became aware of the existence of the HBA regulations. And the pandemic also has introduced the control measures that were already there, that people now became aware that the control measures that they need to implement during the pandemic. So if you remember, we also promulgated the COVID-19 directions for workplaces because there were other additional control measures that were not included in the previous HBA regulations. So what the lessons that I can say is that there was a good collaboration between all stakeholders. You mentioned the private, the public, the civil society. We all came together to make sure that we fight this pandemic. And also, it became important that with the review of the regulation, it must be flexible, so that already we have the technical committee that was established to make sure that should another agent or outbreak comes up and it's a new agent, then the regulations will be easily amended to include that agent in the
Well, thank you very much for that. Certainly during this period, everybody learned much more about occupational health and safety and how to keep yourself safe. So around take-home messages, if I could start with you, Jabu, what is your key take-home message for our audience, for people in the workplace and everybody that contributes to keeping people healthy and safe in the workplace?
I think the key message is that employers need to play a role in making sure that the workplaces are safe for the employees. Employees need to play a role to make sure that they obey all lawful instructions to ensure that their health is protected when they are at workplaces, and all other stakeholders to communicate with us, to work with us together.
Thank you very much for that. Tanusha, your take-home message for our audience and people in the workplace.
I think for me, it's really just to emphasize to the audience how important the regulation is in protecting workers and the public, because there is this interconnectedness between the workplace, the community, and the environment. So it's so crucial, as Jabu has said, that we need to prevent risk to all these stakeholders. We know how formidable these HBAs are, whether they're infectious or not, whether they occur in the healthcare setting or in other settings. So compliance is crucial in terms of the regulation, and as Jabu mentioned, everybody has a role to play, irrespective of whether you're the manager, the shop steward, or the health and safety rep, or just the employee. You have an important role to play. So engage in the workplace with your various organizational structures, the health and safety committee, so that steps are taken to address biological risks and that we are protecting. And I think it's also important to say that it's not just our legal duty, it's a moral imperative. So it is very important. And that I just want to say that healthy workers are productive workers. Productive workers mean that we're going to have profitable workplaces.
Win-win if we do all the right things.
Absolutely.
Taking us home, Tika Lady, your take-home message.
Okay, my one will be that prevention is key, which is why it's important that we do risk assessment and exposure monitoring in the workplace. And lastly, that training must be done before the employee is potentially exposed to HBA. And also refresher training must be done on an annual basis to ensure that all workers are informed and are aware, and they do what they can to protect themselves.
Well, thank you very much, ladies. Thank you very much for your contributions today. And I hope as the audience, you've had the key messages and the important information shared with you by our panelists here today, and to understand your role in the workplace as employees, as employers, as the health and safety representatives, the shop stewards, the health and safety officers, and all the other people from nursing and doctors who play a role in keeping us safe and healthy in the workplace. So thank you very much. We'll see you on the next webinar. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Defined as a microorganism, microbial byproducts or metabolites. Oops, I got that right. Let me start that again.
I think I'm going to cover that.
You're going to cover that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Let's start.
Because my question is, what types of HBAs? So I will say what.
Okay, great. That's number 4.
Yeah, but you can introduce that later.
Okay. And that's reading a definition that you haven't read before. You started. Go practice. Okay. Starting again.